This house is mine, Tessa, and you have no right to stay here, so take those papers and leave before tonight is over.
My husband said, "This house is mine." Then the lawyer arrived with papers that changed everything fast. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. If your spouse claimed your home as their own, what would you do first? Now let's begin. "This house is mine," Graham Voss said, and the words landed harder than the crystal glass he set against the dining table. Tessa Marlowe did not flinch. Across from her, 12 candles burned in a silver candelabrum. Their flames reflected in the dark windows of the townhouse she had spent 7 years restoring. Beside Graham sat Celeste Arden, poised in a cream dress, one hand resting near a champagne flute she had barely touched. At the far end of the table, Adrian Keene, the investment representative Graham had invited for dinner, lowered his fork and glanced toward the leather folder now sliding across the polished walnut. Graham opened it with the calm precision of a man announcing something he believed had already been decided. Divorce papers. A property agreement. A page marked for signature. "You can stay tonight," he continued, adjusting his cuff, "but I want your things gone by morning." The room went still enough for Tessa to hear the faint ticking of the brass clock above the fireplace. 42 minutes until 9. 42 minutes until the deadline on Graham's financing agreement. Celeste reached into her handbag and placed a new brass key beside her glass. Graham smiled at the gesture, proud of it. "The locks were changed this afternoon," he said. Tessa looked at the key, then at the front door beyond the archway. The original lock had been hand-forged in 1912. She had found the matching hardware herself in an estate warehouse outside Baltimore and spent 3 months restoring it. The key on the table was bright, cheap, and unfamiliar. "You changed the locks before telling me?" she asked. Graham leaned back. "I didn't think a scene would help anyone." Tessa almost smiled. A scene. He had invited Adrian, poured expensive wine, seated Celeste in the chair where Tessa's mother once sat, and arranged the papers beneath the chandelier like a centerpiece. This was not privacy. It was theater. Graham turned the folder toward her and uncapped a black fountain pen. "Sign the marked pages, and we can keep this civil." Tessa placed 2 fingers on the paper, but did not pull it closer. Near the bottom of the final page, half hidden beneath another sheet, she saw the blue logo of North Coast Capital. Not a divorce firm, not a family court, a lender. Her eyes moved to the line above the signature box. "Consent of beneficial property holder." "If this house is yours," she asked quietly, "why does your lender need my signature?" Adrian's attention sharpened. Celeste's hand left the key. For the first time that evening, Graham's smile arrived a second too late. "It's routine," he said. "A technical formality." Tessa looked again at the clock. 39 minutes. Then she folded her hands in her lap and said, "We should wait." Graham's jaw tightened. "For what?" Before she answered, the doorbell rang. The doorbell sounded again, softer this time, but no one at the table moved. Graham kept his eyes on Tessa, as if silence alone could force her hand toward the pen. Adrian Keene glanced at his watch. Celeste looked from the new key to the papers, her expression no longer polished enough to hide the question forming behind it. Tessa rose at last. She did not hurry. Her chair slid back across the rug with a quiet scrape, and the small sound seemed to travel farther than it should have. Graham stood halfway. "I will get it," he said. "No," Tessa replied. "You should stay with your guests." She crossed the foyer beneath the narrow stained glass window she had restored during their first winter in the house. The bell rang a third time just as she reached the door. When she opened it, Elias Wren stood beneath the porch light in a charcoal overcoat, holding a black leather case in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. Rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his expression carried the patient seriousness of a man who never needed to raise his voice. "Good evening, Ms. Marlowe," he said. Tessa stepped aside. "You are right on time." Graham appeared at the edge of the dining room. His face changed only slightly, but Tessa saw it. A tightening around the mouth. A brief pause before recognition. "Elias," he said, "I was not aware you were invited." "I was asked to witness a signature," Elias answered. Graham looked at Tessa, then at the envelope. "This is a private family matter." Elias removed his coat and handed it to Tessa without taking his eyes from Graham. "Then I expect privacy will make the facts easier to hear." Adrian stood as Elias entered the dining room. The 2 men exchanged a restrained nod. They had met before. Celeste did not stand. Her fingers had closed around the stem of her glass, though she still had not taken a drink. Graham returned to his chair and forced an easy smile. Tessa has misunderstood a standard consent form, he said. I was explaining that the house is mine, but the lender requires her acknowledgement because we are married. Elias placed the leather case beside the silver candelabrum. Then there should be no difficulty clarifying the record. He sat in the empty chair beside Tessa and removed a slim notepad. Before she signs, I need to confirm the statement you just made. Graham looked toward Adrian, perhaps expecting support. Adrian remained silent. The clock above the fireplace marked another minute. 37 remained. Elias uncapped his pen. You are stating that you are the sole legal owner of this property? Yes, Graham said. And that Ms. Marlowe holds no ownership interest, beneficial interest, or authority over the property? Graham hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but everyone noticed. That is correct. Elias wrote the answer down. You are also stating that the consent form is merely procedural and does not transfer, pledge, or place any financial obligation against an interest belonging to Ms. Marlowe. Graham's smile thinned. Correct. Tessa watched his hand close over the fountain pen he had offered her. His thumb pressed hard against the cap. Elias finished writing, tore the page from the pad, and placed it in the center of the table. Mr. Keene, you heard those statements? Adrian nodded slowly. I did. Celeste shifted in her chair. Graham, what exactly is this form? He turned toward her with a look meant to end the question. It is nothing you need to worry about. Tessa looked down at the document again. Near the bottom, beneath the lender's logo, the language was clearer now that she knew where to look. Authorization to encumber beneficial interest. She rested one fingertip beside the line. This does not acknowledge residence, she said. It authorizes the house to be used as collateral. Adrian stepped closer and read over her shoulder. His expression hardened. Graham, he said, that is not the version described in our closing summary. Graham leaned forward. The attorneys used broader language than necessary. It changes nothing. Elias placed the sealed envelope beside the page. Then perhaps we should begin with what the property records say. Elias rested one hand on the sealed envelope, but did not open it. Before we review the property record, he said, I need to ask one more question. Graham exhaled through his nose and glanced at the clock. 34 minutes remained. We do not have time for a courtroom exercise. Then a simple answer should be efficient. Elias turned the notepad toward him. Did Ms. Marlowe sign any deed transferring her interest in this property to you? Graham's gaze moved briefly to the folder near Tessa's hand. Yes. The word came quickly, too quickly. Elias nodded once. Do you have that document? Graham reached into the leather folder and removed a single page protected by a clear sleeve. He placed it on the table with care, as though the plastic itself could make the paper more official. A quitclaim deed, he said. Signed 2 years ago. Adrian moved closer. Celeste remained seated, but her attention fixed on the page. Tessa did not touch it. She studied the date printed beneath the notary's seal. October 14th. The room around her seemed to narrow. On October 14th, she had been in Lisbon supervising the restoration of a 19th-century theater. She remembered the pale dust on the balcony railings, the sound of rain against the hotel window, and the photograph Graham had sent of himself eating dinner alone. He had written that the house felt empty without her. Where was this signed? Tessa asked. Graham's. Expression did not change. Here. In this house. Yes. Elias opened his leather case and removed a thin file. That is interesting. He placed a passport copy, an airline itinerary, and a hotel receipt beside the deed. Each document carried the same date. Ms. Marlowe entered Portugal 3 days earlier and did not return to the United States until October 23rd. Celeste looked at Graham. You told me she signed it in your office. Graham turned toward her. I said the paperwork was handled through the office. No, Celeste replied softly. You said you watched her sign it. The clock ticked again. Graham loosened his grip on the fountain pen. This is becoming ridiculous. There was a stack of documents. It may have been signed earlier and dated later. Elias removed another sheet from the file. The notary commission number on this seal had expired 6 months before the date shown. Adrian picked up the deed and held it beneath the chandelier. His face hardened as he examined the lower corner. This copy was included in the preliminary title package. Graham stood. and the title company accepted it. They accepted a scan, Adrian said. Our closing condition requires recorded verification. Elias reached into the sealed envelope at last and drew out a certified county record. He placed it beside Graham's document. The page from Graham's folder bore a bold recording number across the top. The certified record showed no matching entry. This deed was never recorded, Elias said. The number printed on it belongs to an unrelated easement filed in another district. Graham remained standing, one hand resting on the back of his chair. For the first time that evening, he looked less like the owner of the room than a guest who had forgotten why he was there. My legal department handled the filing, he said. Then your legal department can explain the discrepancy, Adrian replied. He gathered his closing summary and placed it back in his briefcase. Until then, this transaction cannot proceed. Graham's head turned sharply. You cannot suspend a $48 million financing package over a clerical error. Adrian looked at Tessa, then at the false deed. This is not a clerical error. Celeste slowly pushed the new brass key away from her place setting. It slid across the walnut and stopped beside Graham's untouched wine glass. Tessa watched it come to rest. The small key had looked like a promise when Celeste first placed it on the table. Now it looked like evidence of a future Graham had sold before he owned it. Elias folded his hands. There is still the matter of the actual ownership record. Graham sat down again, but the movement no longer carried confidence. Tessa, he said, lowering his voice, we should discuss this privately. She met his eyes. You invited everyone here. That was before this became complicated. No, she said. It was always complicated. You just expected me not to understand it. Elias placed a second certified document on the table, face down. The county seal showed at the bottom edge. Graham stared at it without reaching forward. Above the fireplace, the clock marked 9:28. 32 minutes remained, and no one in the room believed the deadline still belonged to him. Elias turned the certified document face up. The paper made almost no sound against the walnut table, yet Graham's eyes followed it, as though something heavy had fallen between them. At the top, beneath the county seal, appeared the name Marlowe Restoration Trust. Tessa watched Adrian read the first line, then the second. His attention slowed at the date. 3 years before her wedding. Elias pointed to the recorded owner. The property was purchased by the trust and has remained there without interruption. Graham leaned forward. Tessa is the beneficiary. That does not mean she controls it. Elias opened the file beside him and removed the trust summary. She is the sole current beneficiary and the acting trustee. Celeste looked at Tessa with an expression stripped of ceremony. You own the house? Tessa did not answer immediately. Her gaze moved across the room instead. The plaster medallion above the chandelier had once been split down the center. She had spent 2 summers finding the right artisan to repair it. The fireplace tiles had come from a shuttered hotel in Pennsylvania. The walnut table had been her mother's. Every part of the house carried a history Graham had treated like decoration. The trust owns it, Tessa said. I am responsible for it. Graham gave a short laugh, but no one mistook it for amusement. We are married. I have lived here for 7 years. I paid the taxes. I paid for improvements. Your company paid several household expenses, Elias said. Those payments did not create ownership. Graham looked toward Adrian again. This is irrelevant to the financing. Tessa can authorize the collateral now. Adrian closed the folder in front of him. That is not the issue anymore. It is exactly the issue, Graham replied. She is sitting right here. She can sign. He pushed the fountain pen toward Tessa a second time. It rolled across the table and stopped near her hand. Tessa looked at it, then at him. Years earlier, he had given her that pen after his first major deal closed. He had called it a symbol of everything they would build together. Now he was using it to ask her to place her mother's house beneath a debt she had never approved. What happens if I do not sign? She asked. Graham's voice softened. Then the transaction is delayed, people lose confidence, and a great deal of unnecessary damage follows. To whom? To everyone connected to the company. Tessa tilted her head. Including Celeste? Celeste straightened. Graham did not look at her. This is not about Celeste. You gave her a key before the house was yours, Tessa said. You told Adrian the collateral was secure before I agreed. You told me these were divorce papers when one of them was a financing authorization. So I am asking carefully. Who were you protecting? Graham pressed his palms against the table. I was protecting what I built. The answer settled over the room. Not what they built. Not their marriage. Not even the employees he had mentioned. What he built. Elias reached into the file again. There is another document we need to address. Graham's eyes sharpened. What document? Elias placed a photocopy beside the unsigned consent form. It showed the same lender logo, the same property description, and a signature written above Tessa's printed name. Adrian picked it up. This was in the preliminary submission. Tessa leaned closer. The signature resembled hers from a distance. The first letter curved correctly. The final stroke lifted in the right direction. But the middle was too smooth. Her real signature always tightened around the second syllable, a habit left from years of signing restoration permits in cramped spaces. This one had been copied by someone who saw the shape, but not the motion. I did not sign that, she said. Graham answered before anyone asked him. It was probably an internal draft. Elias looked at Adrian. Was it represented as a draft? Adrian shook his head. It was represented as executed consent. Celeste stared at Graham. You already had her signature? A version of it, he said. For review. Tessa held out her hand. Adrian gave her the page. She placed it beside the fountain pen, then slipped off her wedding ring and set that down as well. The small circle of gold caught the candlelight. You did not need my understanding, she said. You only needed my name. Graham's face changed then, not with regret, but calculation. He looked at the clock. 27 minutes remained. Tessa, listen to me. We can correct the paperwork after closing. Adrian stood. There will be no closing tonight. Graham turned toward him. You are making a mistake. No, Adrian said. I am preventing one. Elias drew one final sheet from the file, but kept it face down beneath his hand. Before we discuss what happens next, Mr. Voss, you should know that the trust agreement contains a specific provision for attempted unauthorized transfer. Elias turned the final sheet face up. The provision is called a protective reversion clause, he said. If anyone attempts to pledge, transfer, or encumber the property without the trustee's written authorization, every temporary occupancy right connected to that person may be terminated immediately. Graham stared at the paragraph Elias indicated. The candlelight moved across the page, catching the embossed seal at the bottom. Temporary occupancy right, he repeated. I am her husband. You were permitted to live here through the marriage. Elias replied. Permission is not ownership. Celeste looked toward the foyer, where her coat hung beside Graham's. The distance from the dining table to the front door was less than 30 feet, but the house no longer seemed to belong to the future he had described to her. You told me the deed was already in your name, she said. Graham did not look at her. This is a technical dispute being exaggerated by people who do not understand the business consequences. Adrian closed the clasps on his briefcase. I understand them clearly. You represented an asset as available collateral when it was not yours to pledge. You submitted a consent bearing a signature the named party denies. You provided a deed that was never recorded. Those are not technical details. Graham rose again, but this time no one followed the movement. The company employs 400 people. If you freeze this financing over paperwork, payroll is affected, vendors are affected, families are affected. Tessa watched him reach for the language of responsibility only after his authority had failed. When did the company need this money? She asked. Graham turned to her. That is not relevant. When? Adrian answered instead. The bridge loan matures tomorrow morning. Celeste's face lost what little color remained. You said the financing was for expansion. It is, Graham said. After existing obligations are resolved. You said the company had no cash problem. Celeste, this is not the time. She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. You made it the time when you invited me to watch you remove your wife from her own home. The new key still rested beside Graham's wine glass. Celeste picked it up, turned it once between her fingers, and placed it in the center of the table. What else did you tell me that depended on her signature? Graham's expression hardened. I offered you a future. You offered me a room in someone else's house. The clock marked 9:37. 23 minutes remained. Adrian stepped away from the table and took out his phone. I am notifying North Coast Capital that the closing is suspended pending a full legal review. Graham moved toward him. Do not make that call. Adrian held his gaze. You no longer have the authority to instruct me. He walked into the foyer, speaking in a low voice to the legal department. Graham stood beneath the chandelier with one hand at his side and the other still resting near the unsigned papers. Tessa noticed that he had stopped touching the fountain pen. Elias gathered the false deed, the consent form, and the certified trust record into separate clear sleeves. These documents will need to be preserved exactly as they are, he said. No alterations, no replacement pages, and no further circulation. Graham looked at Tessa. His voice lowered. You arranged this. I asked Elias to come, she said. Because 3 weeks ago, I received a notice from the county requesting confirmation of a transfer I never approved. Graham's eyes shifted toward the false deed. You should have come to me. I did. Tessa's voice remained even. I asked whether the house had been used in any company transaction. You told me I was imagining problems because I did not understand finance. A memory passed across his face. Not guilt. Recognition. He remembered the morning, the coffee between them, the way he had smiled as he dismissed her. Tessa reached into the pocket of her dress and removed the old brass key she had carried since her mother's death. Unlike Celeste's new key, its edges were worn smooth from decades of use. Graham looked at it. What does that open? Tessa closed her fingers around it. The box containing the original trust documents. Elias placed another envelope beside her hand, and the original signature records. Adrian returned to the dining room and slipped his phone into his coat. The closing is officially on hold. Graham's gaze moved from Adrian to Elias, then finally to Tessa. The room he had arranged as a stage had become a record of every statement he had made. What happens now, he asked. Elias did not answer. Tessa looked at the key in her palm, then at the man who had demanded that she leave before morning. Now, she said, we determine who has the right to stay. Tessa did not move from her chair. The old brass key rested in her palm, its worn edge catching the candlelight. Elias opened the envelope beside her and removed a certified copy of the occupancy provision. Graham watched the page emerge with the stillness of someone trying to calculate whether confidence could survive one more fact. The trust gives the acting trustee authority to revoke residential permission when the property is used without consent, Elias said. The attempted pledge, the false deed, and the disputed signature satisfy that condition. Graham looked at Tessa. You would remove me from the house over a financing document. You tried to remove me before dinner was finished, she replied. Celeste lowered her eyes. The new key remained in the center of the table between them. Graham turned toward Elias. Even if that clause exists, notice is required. Correct. Elias slid a second document from the envelope. This is the notice. Graham read the first line, then looked up sharply. Effective tonight. Effective upon delivery, Elias said. You are receiving it now. Adrian stood near the fireplace with his briefcase in hand, no longer a guest. Only a witness waiting for the final consequence of a transaction he had already stopped. The brass clock marked 9:41. 19 minutes remained before the closing deadline, but the deadline no longer carried power. The money would not arrive. The house would not secure the loan. The signature Graham needed would remain unwritten. Tessa watched him glance around the dining room as though searching for something that still belonged to him. His eyes passed over the chandelier, the restored plaster, the fireplace tiles, and the walnut table. He had lived among those things for years without learning the story of any of them. I have personal property throughout this house, he said. Clothing, files, furniture. You may arrange supervised access tomorrow, Elias replied. Tonight, you may take essential belongings. Graham gave a humorless smile. Supervised access to my own bedroom. A bedroom inside property you do not own, Elias said. Celeste rose slowly. She picked up her handbag and coat from the back of the chair. Graham looked at her. Where are you going? Home. This can be resolved. You told me it was already resolved. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. She pointed toward the papers. You said she had signed everything. You said the house was yours. You said tonight was only a formality. Graham stood. I was trying to protect the deal. You were trying to make everyone believe the deal was real before the facts caught up with you. Celeste placed the new key beside the unsigned consent form. I do not want this. Graham's expression tightened. Do not be dramatic. Celeste looked at Tessa, then back at him. You invited me here to watch you humiliate her. That was the dramatic part. She walked toward the foyer. The front door opened, letting in a brief current of cool, rain-scented air, then closed softly behind her. No one spoke for several seconds. Tessa heard the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and water moving through the old pipes behind the wall. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a house continuing after a promise ended. Graham turned back to her. You planned for her to be here. You invited her, Tessa said. You planned for Adrian to see this. You invited him. And Elias? I invited the person who could verify the truth. Graham looked down at the wedding ring beside the fountain pen. So this was a trap. Tessa closed her hand around the old key. No. A trap hides what it is. I asked you 3 weeks ago whether you had used this house for company debt. You said no. Tonight, I asked why you needed my signature. You called it routine. Elias asked whether the house belonged to you. You said yes. Every door was open, Graham. You chose which one to walk through. Adrian checked his phone. North Coast Capital has issued a preservation notice. All files connected to the collateral submission must remain unchanged. Graham's face lost the last of its practiced ease. What does that mean for the company? Adrian met his eyes. It means the board will review everything before deciding what remains. Elias placed the termination notice directly in front of Graham. And this means you need to decide what you are taking with you tonight. Graham looked at Tessa for a long moment. You would end 12 years like this? She looked at the unsigned page, the false signature, the returned key, and the ring she no longer wore. No, she said. You ended it long before tonight. I am only refusing to sign beneath it. Graham did not touch the termination notice. He stood beside the table, staring at the paper as though refusing to hold it could keep the words from becoming real. Adrian moved toward the foyer and paused long enough to address Tessa. North Coast Capital will contact your counsel tomorrow. We will need a formal statement confirming that you did not authorize the deed or the consent form. You will have it, Elias said. Adrian nodded, then looked at Graham. The board will also require access to every document submitted under your name during the last 6 months. Graham's mouth tightened. You are treating me like a criminal. I am treating this like a record that must be verified, Adrian replied. He put on his coat and left without another word. The front door closed, and the townhouse settled into a quieter kind of tension. Only 4 candles remained burning. Their light reached the papers, the returned key, and the wedding ring, but left the far corners of the room in shadow. Elias checked the time. You should gather what you need for tonight. Graham looked at Tessa. And where exactly am I supposed to go? She held his gaze. You own a hotel membership, 3 corporate apartments, and a townhouse you told the bank was available for collateral. I think you can solve that problem. He gave a bitter smile. So this is revenge. Tessa looked around the room. Revenge would have been louder. Revenge would have needed an audience and applause. What she felt was quieter than that. It was the stillness that came when a door finally stopped pressing against its frame. No, she said. This is a boundary. Graham glanced toward Elias. Can she legally force me out tonight? Elias slid the notice closer. The trust can revoke occupancy immediately when there is evidence of unauthorized transfer. You were offered the opportunity to leave voluntarily. If you refuse, the next steps become formal and public. Graham finally picked up the notice. He read the first page, then the second. His eyes stopped at the paragraph requiring supervised access to personal belongings. This is humiliating. Tessa's expression did not change. You arranged dinner so I could be dismissed in front of your lender and the woman you planned to move into my home. The words were quiet, but they left nowhere for him to hide. Do not ask me to protect you from the feeling you prepared for me. Graham looked away. For several seconds, the only sound was the paper shifting in his hands. Then he walked toward the staircase. Elias rose. You may take clothing, medication, personal electronics, and essential documents. Nothing connected to the financing or property records may leave the house. Graham stopped at the first step. You do not trust me to pack a bag? Tonight is not about trust, Elias said. It is about preservation. Graham continued upstairs. His footsteps faded above them. Tessa remained seated. She had imagined this moment during the 3 weeks since the county notice arrived. In some versions, she confronted him in the kitchen. In others, she left before he returned from work. None of those imagined endings had included candles, a false deed, or Celeste placing a useless key on the table. Elias gathered the documents into labeled sleeves. You handled that well, he said. Tessa looked at the wedding ring beside her hand. I handled it late. Late is not the same as never. She picked up the ring, but did not put it on. It felt lighter than she remembered. Upstairs, a closet door opened, then closed. Tessa turned the old brass key between her fingers. Her mother had given it to her on the day the trust was signed. At the time, Tessa had thought it was only a key to a document box. Now she understood it had also been a warning. Keep proof of what is yours. Keep it somewhere no one else controls. Graham returned 12 minutes later carrying a leather overnight bag and his laptop case. He had removed his tie. Without the polished details, he looked less powerful and more tired. He stopped near the dining room entrance. Celeste will not answer me. Tessa said nothing. Adrian will destroy the company. Adrian stopped a transaction, she replied. What happens to the company depends on what you did before tonight. Graham looked at the table, at the evidence arranged in clear sleeves, then at the fountain pen. There has to be another way. Tessa placed the termination notice in front of him and turned the pen so the point faced his hand. There is, she said. Acknowledge receipt. Leave peacefully. Let the truth be reviewed without creating another false version of it. Graham stared at the signature line. At the beginning of the evening, he had placed that same pen before her and expected obedience. Now his hand hovered above it, and the room waited for him to understand the difference between being forced and facing a consequence. After a long silence, he picked up the pen. Graham lowered the pen to the page, but his signature did not come easily. The first stroke paused halfway through, leaving a dark mark that looked less like confidence than hesitation. Tessa watched without satisfaction. The moment was not clean enough for triumph. Too many years sat between them. Too many mornings in the kitchen. Too many plans spoken as though love alone could make them honest. Graham finished signing and set the pen down. Elias examined the acknowledgement, added the time, and placed it inside a clear sleeve. 9:49. 11 minutes remained before the financing deadline. This confirms receipt of the termination notice, Elias said. It does not waive any rights or determine the outcome of the document review. Graham gave a tired laugh. You make everything sound temporary while taking everything away. Elias looked at him evenly. The house was never yours to lose. The words changed the room more than any raised voice could have. Graham glanced toward Tessa, perhaps waiting for her to soften them, but she remained still. He picked up his overnight bag. What happens when the company collapses? He asked. Will that make this feel fair? Tessa looked at the false signature under the candlelight. Fair would have been telling me the truth before using my name. Fair would have been asking instead of assuming. What happens now is not something I created. His eyes moved to the wedding ring on the table. You think you are separate from all of this, but you benefited from the company too. I benefited from what I believed we were building, she said. That is not permission to turn my trust into your emergency fund. Graham looked toward the clock. The board will panic when the loan does not close. Adrian had already explained the next steps, but Graham still spoke as if the outcome might change if he described it as unreasonable. Elias gathered the remaining pages. The board has been informed that the closing is suspended. They will review the company's obligations, the collateral submissions, and any representations made to lenders. And if they remove me, that decision belongs to them. Graham's jaw tightened. Everyone suddenly has authority except me. Tessa met his eyes. You had authority. You used it to avoid consent. The clock reached 9:52. The old house seemed to breathe around them as the heating system settled behind the walls. Graham turned toward the foyer, then stopped beside the new brass key Celeste had left behind. He picked it up and held it between two fingers. She knew nothing about the paperwork. Then do not make her responsible for your choices, Tessa said. He placed the key back on the table. For the first time all evening, he did not try to arrange the objects around him. He simply left them where they were. Elias walked with him to the foyer while Tessa remained by the dining table. She heard the quiet exchange about supervised access, the return of the exterior key, and the date for collecting the rest of his belongings. Graham emptied his pockets onto the narrow console. A silver key ring, a garage remote, the security card for the rear entrance. Each item made a small sound against the wood. When he returned to the dining room, he carried only his bag, his laptop case, and his coat. The polished image he had constructed for the evening had thinned into something ordinary. Did you know the whole time? He asked Tessa. About the trust, yes. About the financing. Not until the county notice arrived. Then you waited. I verified. Graham looked at Elias. And recorded me. Elias gestured toward the signed witness statement. You were asked clear questions. You gave clear answers. Graham turned back to Tessa. You could have warned me before tonight. She looked at the table where he had placed divorce papers in front of an audience. You could have told me before signing my name. The clock reached 9:56. 4 minutes remained. Graham seemed to hear it too. He looked up at the brass face above the fireplace, then down at the unsigned consent form. The closing he had planned for weeks was now only minutes from expiring. No one rushed. No one called to rescue it. At exactly 10 o'clock, Adrian sent Elias a short message confirming that the financing window had closed without execution. Elias read it once, then placed his phone face down. Graham did not ask what it said. He already knew. He lifted his bag and walked toward the front door. Before crossing the threshold, he looked back at Tessa. You really chose the house over me. She stood beneath the restored chandelier, one hand resting near the old brass key. No, she said. I chose the truth after you chose everything else. Graham stepped outside. Elias closed the door gently behind him, and the lock settled into place with a single quiet click. For several seconds after the door closed, Tessa stood without moving. The old lock held. Rain whispered against the stained glass window, and the quiet inside the townhouse felt different now, not empty, but returned. Elias remained near the foyer, giving her the dignity of silence while the last 4 candles burned low in the dining room. On the table, the evening had arranged itself into evidence. The false deed, the unsigned consent, the returned key, the wedding ring, and the fountain pen Graham had first pushed toward her as if her name belonged to him. Tessa walked back to the table and picked up the ring. She remembered the day he had placed it on her finger beneath an arbor of white roses, his voice unsteady with promises they both believed. The memory did not disappear because the marriage had failed. It simply stopped demanding that she excuse what came after. She opened the small drawer beneath the sideboard and placed the ring inside. Not hidden, not displayed. Finished. Elias gathered the final documents into his case. The house will be secure tonight, he said. I will file the formal notices first thing in the morning. Tessa nodded. What happens to Graham? That depends on the board, the lenders, and the document review. You do not have to decide that tonight. She looked toward the front door. For years, Graham had made every crisis feel like a question only she could answer for him. His missed dinner became her failure to understand ambition. His distance became her failure to be supportive. His secrecy became something she was expected to forgive before she was permitted to name it. Now, for the first time, his consequences belonged entirely to him. Elias closed his leather case. Your mother designed the trust carefully. Tessa turned the old brass key in her hand. She never trusted easy promises. She trusted you. The words settled more gently than comfort. Tessa walked him to the door. Before leaving, Elias paused beneath the stained glass window. You did not cause what happened here tonight. I know, she said, and realized that she meant it. After he left, Tessa locked the door and returned to the dining room alone. The clock above the fireplace showed 10:17. 17 minutes into a life she had not planned, but no longer feared. She extinguished the candles one by one until only the chandelier remained. Without the flames, the room looked less like a stage and more like the place she had built from cracked plaster, damaged wood, and patient work. She picked up Celeste's new key. It was lighter than it appeared. Graham had presented it as proof of a future, but it opened nothing that mattered. Tessa placed it in the drawer beside the wedding ring. Then she carried the false papers to the desk Elias had designated and left them untouched. Preservation, he had called it. The word felt larger than law. There were things worth preserving and things that had survived only because she had been afraid to release them. Near midnight, Tessa climbed the staircase. Graham's side of the bedroom was already stripped of the essentials he had taken. The empty space did not wound her the way she expected. On the dresser sat a framed photograph from their 5th anniversary. She studied the woman she had been then, smiling into sunlight, unaware that loyalty without truth could slowly become a room without air. Tessa removed the photograph, kept the frame, and placed the picture inside a box. In the morning, she opened every curtain in the house. Sunlight reached the restored floorboards and climbed the wall beside the staircase. The walnut table still bore the faint mark where Graham's pen had rested. Tessa touched it once, then opened the front door to let in the cool morning air. She had not defeated him. She had not taken anything from him. She had simply stopped allowing his certainty to outweigh the truth. The house remained where it had always been, and so did she. no longer waiting for permission to belong to her own life.